In today's Locked On Pelicans, I'm going to tell you why coming up with a mock trade for Robert Williams III reveals the Pelicans have a salary problem, and it could lead to moving Brandon Ingram for parts. It's Tuesday's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Let's go.
You are Locked On Pelicans, your daily New Orleans Pelicans podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to another edition of Locked On Pelicans, the daily podcast covering your favorite team, the New Orleans Pelicans at NBA, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, available wherever you get your podcasts and available on YouTube. I'm your host, Pelicans Insider, credential member of the media, Jake Madison, at NOLA Jake on Twitter. Here with you on this Tuesday. We're going to go Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday this week here on Locked On Pelicans. Hopefully you're all staying dry this week in South Louisiana and parts of Texas as well. And of course, thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Join over 10,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well. Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. So in today's show, we're going to talk about trading for Robert Williams III, but it's going to present a problem for the Pelicans. And if you're an everydayer, meaning you listen Monday through Friday to Locked On Pelicans, or a longtime listener, what I'm about to tell you won't necessarily shock you. It'll be in the second segment, but it presents a problem for trying to upgrade the team in the middle of the season. And that will, at least potentially, have impacts on a Brandon Ingram trade. So I will get you there. I know you want to hear about the Brandon Ingram stuff, but let's start with Robert Williams II as a trade target. Brian Windhorst brought him up on a recent podcast as a guy that should get moved. You know, the Portland Trailblazers are massively rebuilding. You know, this is someone who hasn't played a lot for them, but could be an impactful player. If you can get something for him, you may as well. And that makes him a good buy low candidate for the New Orleans Pelicans. I think that makes a ton of sense. So why Robert Williams III, before we even just get into the issue here, because this is someone that if you can figure out a 3-team deal, 4-team trade, that I think they really should go after. He is kind of what you're looking for. Like if you want to play small ball in a sense, Robert Williams III at 6'9" fits that bill, right? This is a guy who plays primarily center and he's just got some leap ability, vertical spacing on offense, and gives you some shot blocking and like rim protection on defense. He makes an absolute ton of sense for what the Pelicans are maybe trying to do in a way. You know, especially when you look at the centers on the roster of the only one with really NBA experience is Daniel Tice. Yes, you have Trey Jemison on a 2-way, and maybe he ends up starting at some point, and I wouldn't be shocked by that. We've been talking about that here for a while. And, you know, if you just don't trust those options, you know, Tice at the end of his career, Jemison being young, you know, you have Robert Williams, who has played in 215 NBA games, starting 97 of them. But there's issues with maybe trading for him, right? Like I know you got on the trade machine to try and figure out a deal once you heard Brian Windhorst mention him. And that's also because his salary is movable, right? This year he's making $12.4 million. Next season it's $13.285. Like that's not a bad option for the New Orleans Pelicans because their salary's top heavy, and we'll talk more about that and why that hurts trades later in the show. So he's got a salary that kind of fits into that sweet spot of what New Orleans could use if they want to try and upgrade their roster. But there's a couple of problems with Robert Williams III too, and these are the trade-offs you get. You're going to get good spring ability on defense, but you're going to get very, very limited offense. This is someone who at the rim is great, and anywhere else is just absolutely putrid. He can't shoot anywhere other than right at the rim. It's just truly like that simple. You give him 3 feet in the restricted area, you know, that way area, he's great. You know, for his career, he shot on those 81% on 0 to 3 feet. He's a lob threat, right? They don't have a true lob threat outside of maybe Carlo on this team. Makes sense to get him, put him in pick and rolls, loft the ball up. Zion can do that, and he can flush it down. He can do that really well. Need some block shots. He has a higher block percentage than anyone else on this team. For his career, it's 7.3. It's a pretty good number. Jonas Valanciunas, by comparison, was, I think, 3.6. So it's about double that sort of number here. Those are all perfect. He's an above average rebounder too, particularly on the defensive glass. That's an important thing. You know, he's a better defensive rebounder, at least the numbers say, than Larry Nance Jr. So you upgrade in that area while still kind of getting your springy, smaller center. Couple of issues here though. One, the offense is lacking, but I don't think you need offense from the center position. You do need someone who can defend on the perimeter, and that's not really what Robert Williams does. We've seen him in the playoffs, particularly against the Miami Heat, that when you involve him as a primary defender in actions, in the pick and roll, things like that, he's a little bit limited due to a lack of that side-to-side athleticism. And that's not something that's going to work on this team. And he's not, in my opinion, a true rim protector. He works better. I watched a bunch of film on him yesterday as like a help defender, kind of roaming around a little bit, rotating off of his guy and then coming over and blocking shots on a rotation as a help defender, rather than like a Rudy Gobert, like you're not going to get anywhere near the rim when I'm standing down low. That's not what he does. He uses his athleticism to make those blocks. That said, he is sturdier and can defend some of the better, bigger centers one-on-one here. So does he exactly fit what the Pelicans need? Probably not. But given the options right now, I don't know, you could definitely do worse. And I don't know if you're actually going to do better at the center spot than him right now. And he's cheap. But there's an injury concern too, and that's what's making him cheap. This is a guy who at one point in his career has made it an all-defensive team and was getting votes for Defensive Player of the Year. But he played just 6 games last year, just 35 the year before that. He's only played over 60 games once in his career. Now, one of those was the COVID-shortened season where he played 52, so that's good. But he has, at this point in his career, missed more games than he has played. That worries me. He's had 2 knee surgeries already with the Boston Celtics before him just missing the majority of last season. And that's not, an ideal scenario whatsoever for that team, where he had another knee injury last year with the Portland Trailblazers that limited him to just 6 games. So injury history, do we want more of that here in New Orleans? I don't know. But here's the bigger issue. We can talk about him, why it makes sense, why the Pelicans should take a flyer on him. And look, for cheap enough, yes, of course. But I want you, if you love those trade machines, to go want to try and find a deal that makes sense. And you're going to struggle by doing that, because his salary at $12.4 million next season, nothing really works out well. Don't forget, in the NBA, the salaries need to match here. And given that the Pelicans have 4 guys making basically $30 million or above, Zion at 36.7, Ingram at 36, CJ at 33.3, and Murray, let's round up and call it 30, they don't have a lot of that mid-tier salary. They have these guys making 30 or more, and then dudes making $5 million or less, essentially. The only guy in the middle is Herb Jones, and you're not including him in this deal whatsoever. It is really tough to find a trade to make this work. And that doesn't just apply to Robert Williams. That would apply to anyone making around, $12 to $16 million in salary, even into the 20s. It's tough to find a one-on-one trade between the Pelicans and the other team that makes this work. Between just the Pelicans and the Portland Trailblazers, you're not really going to find a deal that makes sense unless you're sending out Brandon Ingram for DeAndre Ayton or something like that, and then bringing back Robert Williams. And I don't think that is something that the Portland Trailblazers are going to do. So it becomes really difficult to figure out exactly what to do here. But that means it's also going to be hard upgrading the roster. And yes, there's ways, and we'll talk about them in the next segment, for the Pelicans to absorb his salary as a trade exception. But that also creates other issues. So this leads to the bigger question, right? Talking about trading for Robert Williams III brings up the bigger question of how do the Pelicans improve this team during the season, and what steps do they need to do to make sure that they can actually do that should the opportunity arise? Because they're in some trouble with that right now. So let's break that down coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by our sponsor, BetterHelp. What's something you'd love to learn? As an adult, do you make time for learning new things as often as you'd like, or was that just lost in childhood? Kids are always learning and growing, but as adults, sometimes we lose that curiosity. So what's something you'd like to learn? Gardening, a new language, maybe how to finally beat your brother or a sibling or something like that in basketball? Therapy can help you reconnect with your sense of wonder because your back to school era can come at any stage. Therapy is not just for people who've experienced major trauma. Whatever it is you just kind of need in your life, maybe you're just feeling down and you need to shake out of that somehow and get some help working through it. Maybe there's just a couple of difficulties in your life right now and you're not sure what to do because life doesn't come with a playbook. Maybe it's just positive coping skills, how to set boundaries. Therapy just empowers you to be the best version of yourself. So if you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist, and you can switch therapists anytime for no additional charge. Rediscover your curiosity with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOnNBA today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOnNBA. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast coming to you like nobody else does, covering the topics that you want to hear. The season is around the corner. Next week, by the way, we are back to 5 days a week. That's why I'm doing Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday here. Get back in the groove of consecutive days and everything. My off season is over. I am energized. I'm ready to go and talk about this team and what's going to be fun, hopefully interesting year at the very least. So I hope you're along for the ride with me here at the Locked On Pelicans podcast. For your second listen today, Locked On NBA, no off season in the NBA, and the season's right around the corner. Locked On NBA provides the daily basketball analysis from national and local experts that you want in 30 minutes or less. No one keeps you as informed and entertained as Locked On NBA, available on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Okay, so trading for Robert Williams III proves some challenges in terms of like a one-on-one deal. You could get this done with a third team, all that. It's like impossible to try and predict those and project those. So we're not going to do that. We're just going to look at it straight up, right? Like say one guy just needs to be moved from his team. Can the Pelicans go and get him? Yes or no? They have the draft picks, they have everything else, but the salary's creating some issues. And we've talked about this a lot here on Locked On Pelicans. So this shouldn't surprise you if you are an everydayer. So that's why you should listen to Locked On Pelicans. But that's where it presents a problem. Trying to upgrade the roster midseason. Let's remove Brandon Ingram here for a second in all of this. Is not going to necessarily be easy because of that, right? You can't even really go and get a $10 million guy. So one of the ways I was trying to work out a trade and see what we could do here, one of the things that you can do now, and it's new this offseason, this season, is use your mid-level exception as a trade exception. The Pelicans have 2 trade exceptions currently, one from the Kira Lewis Jr. deal, one from the Jonas Valanciunas sign-in trade. Those are useful because what they allow you to do is say that Jonas Valanciunas trade exception is $10 million. You just bring a player into that trade exception. You don't need to send out salary or anything like that. You kind of just the way I always describe it is absorb the player into that traded player exception as long as the salary fits and then just they're on the team. And then you've got to send something back in return. But if someone's just trying to salary dump a guy, you send a fake second round pick, something like that. Basically just get a guy for free. So say Robert Williams with his injury history, the Pelicans use one of their mid-level exception as a trade exception. It's $12.8 million that just fits Robert Williams III in it. And you bring him back to New Orleans in exchange for, call it a second round pick swap, something like that. Here's the thing. Doesn't work. The Pelicans are pretty close to the NBA's hard cap. And first apron hard cap. There's a couple of different versions of it, but we've talked about it here. The first apron the Pelicans are not allowed to exceed. They're not allowed to go over that at all. So the Pelicans, as I have it right now, are $2.272137, so $2.27 million away from that first apron line. If you just absorb Robert Williams into the traded player exception, doesn't work because you're over it by about $10 million or so, like just at that number. So, or about $9.6 million. Doesn't work. So you can't even use that non-taxpayer mid-level exception that the Pelicans, have and have the ability to use, but they can't, because if they basically add anyone through it that's over like $2.7 million right now, and you don't need to use it for that, essentially, you can't go over that. So they have this asset there that's just kind of sitting there and isn't able to be used really at all. And I wouldn't find that to be an ideal situation. Now, you could waive Matt Ryan from this, and that would free up another $2.1 million, giving him about 4.35, something like that, room for the first apron. But that doesn't fix the problem here. There isn't a center really for that amount of money. You could do it for Walker Kessler, someone like that. That's why we focused on him a lot. But Robert Williams is a buy low candidate where maybe it would just take a second round pick. You can't do that. And so how does this team upgrade during the middle of the season? I'm not entirely sure. There's not a ton of like amazingly good players that teams are just going to give up on that are essentially making $5 million or less, where you could use some of the guys that you have to try and like match that salary, right? Jordan Hawkins, $4.5 million. If you don't see him as part of the future, you can upgrade by trading him. Daniel Tice is at $2 million, 2.1. Jose is at $2 million. Jeremiah Robinson Earl is 2.2. Like, these are not easy guys to like move and then just get someone significantly better back. And that Robert Williams III salary slot is like exactly the sweet spot for what New Orleans wants to add. They aren't looking outside of a Brandon Ingram or CJ McCollum trade to bring back a guy that's like $20+ million. And there's not a ton that they would necessarily like truly want anyway, let's say, that are like realistic trade targets for them. It's not going to work, for a $20+ million guy with Trey getting an extension, in soon coming weeks and all of that. They're limited here. This might be why the roster that we see is the roster that we're going to see all season long. So the roster that they have on opening night is the roster that, we might see all season long because of that. So it shows the limitations here. And look, if you were to bring back a $20 million guy, you're likely moving out Brandon Ingram or CJ in that deal. And then you're also likely going to move the other one of Ingram or CJ, whoever doesn't get moved, next season because of the Trey Murphy extension. So bringing someone in at $20 million essentially mean $20 million or more, essentially means both BI and CJ are gone, in my opinion, over the next 16, 18 months, something like that, maybe is probably what it would be. So it shows that the Pelicans are kind of limited on what they can do. It's great to have all these draft picks and everything that you have, and they use some of those, cash some of those in for DeJounte Murray, and I like that move, and I think he fits perfectly for what this team wants. But now you can't use those picks necessarily to go and get the other players that you want, right? You can't even right now just trade a first-round pick, not that you would, for Robert Williams III, because there's no way to do it. There's just no way to make that deal done unless you're trading 5-6 players, and that's not going to happen because that's not realistic. So that's not a good situation for the Pelicans to be in whatsoever. And then that leads to, do you have to take a weirder, different approach to trading Brandon Ingram? And I think maybe you do. And this is something that we've talked a lot about here on the show, but this kind of emphasizes that point. And I'll explain what that is. Why trading him for, I'm going to put it in air quotes, parts, isn't maybe the worst idea, even if that's not the return any of us, probably including the Pelicans front office, was envisioning for Brandon Ingram. But maybe that's why it makes the most sense right now. That's coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. We got something a little bit different for you. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Then with a YouTube TV base plan, you'll be able to watch every regular season Sunday afternoon out-of-market game. And all you need is a Google account and a current form of payment, and you can cancel at any time. It was great just watching football on my couch on Sunday. Barely left the house. It was awesome. Loved it. With with the YouTube TV base plan and NFL Sunday ticket, you can get all of the games. You're not just stuck with the ones on TV. Look, $5 is an easy bet. The Pelicans have their opening night line against the Chicago Bulls out right now. They're -5. They're good. They win on opening night. They blow teams out. The -5 sounds pretty good to me. So if you want to get in on opening night's action before maybe something changes, you can do it right now over at FanDuel.com, where you can download America's #1 sportsbook. Pelicans -5. I like it. So visit FanDuel.com right now. Download America's #1 sportsbook to get in on the action here. FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of Locked On. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast, covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Join over 10,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well. And now for your second listen, Locked On Saints. What the heck was that on Sunday? Derek Carr looking good. The offense looking good. Bombing throws deep. A little bit of creativity. Maybe running when he shouldn't have, or not sliding, I guess. I loved it. Is that how they're going to look all year? Is that a Panthers thing? I'm worried about that. Locked On Saints with host Ross Jackson is going to break down everything black and gold for you. So now let's talk about what this means for Brandon Ingram. I saved it for the end here, kind of buried the lead a little bit, but I wanted to kind of walk you through the process. So what does this mean for Brandon Ingram? Not having that mid-tier salary to upgrade the roster, there's very limited paths for them right now outside of a Brandon Ingram trade to go and get like a starting caliber center. But look, we've seen the Ingram trade value isn't enough to get that done. If they could trade Ingram for like a starting center that they liked, they'd have done it by now. Right? It's really that simple. And then Ingram no-shows, and I don't think that's the end of the world, but I don't think it's a great look either. And this, I'm a little more down on him than I was at the start of the offseason, where I was maybe expecting kind of a bounce back year in a sense for Ingram, where he understands he needs to shoot more threes, but, with that Instagram thing of like, you gotta, go where people value. Like, dude, you got to change a little bit. And I don't know if that self-awareness is there with that sort of thing right now. So that introspection is there. So that makes me want to move him a little bit more. And that might mean you move him for, and I'm putting this in air quotes again, for parts, quote unquote. Not for a starting level guy or even guys that are particularly like amazing. They'll beef you up with their depth or anything. It's you trade him for salary that you can trade later. You use Brandon Ingram to indirectly get a guy like Robert Williams III or others. You trade Ingram, who, what did we say he was making exactly this year? Where'd my spreadsheet go? Ingram's making $36 million this year. So you trade him for two guys making $16 million each. Now, all of a sudden, you can go get, you trade one of them for Robert Williams III with a pick and you upgrade, right? When we were looking at a team like the Sacramento Kings and trying to figure out a trade for Ingram there that made sense, it was you trade Ingram for Harrison Barnes and another player, and then, a pick maybe. And like the player return isn't sexy. It's not exciting. The pick's not going to be particularly good, but then you flip one of those players and that pick for the piece that you want because the salary makes sense. These are just the rules in place and how deals need to be structured and get done. And it can be difficult to try and find this. This is why, the front office of the Pelicans of every NBA team has like cap specialists that look at all of that to figure out, who it is. This is a group, a team that's also going to have someone in their front office. Every team does this, is like, here are the guys we can trade for this. Here's everywhere. If we trade this person, here's everyone that kind of fits if we just do a one-on-one deal, right? And so you need to get some of that salary, I think. And that might mean that you trade Brandon Ingram for parts, for guys that aren't difference makers themselves, that, might not be starters, but might come off the bench and just be depth pieces. And then you flip one of them for someone else. And I think that's how you can then upgrade the team, not just in one way, but in two. You could get a starting center and then maybe some wing depth too. You could get a starting center and, something else, whatever it is you might be looking for, more shooting, more defense. You can find those guys out there and then use your picks, the additional picks that the Pelicans have, to go and get that. They've got a pick from Milwaukee next year that they could trade. They have their own pick. After that, I'm trying to find, then all the picks like start to run out, but they have all of their own picks after that. So to me, there's still moves that they could make. And why, if you keep everyone on the team as is, like I don't see a ton of moves they can make during the season. It's very, very limited. Walker Kessler, maybe something else. If you move Ingram for 2 other tradable guys that make mid-tier salary, well, now all of a sudden you can make lots of moves if you need to during the season and readjust on the fly. In February, if they have the roster as it is right now and you don't trade Brandon Ingram, it's going to be a quiet trade deadline, and they're probably just going to make a deal that gets them, out of the luxury tax, probably waiving Matt Ryan, and then they still need to cut about $1.5 million from the luxury tax. I have them right now in at $3.645 million. They'll want to get under that. But if you could massively make a move that maybe sends you on a Mavs kind of run at the trade deadline, could you? Now, I don't know if the Pelicans are going to pay the tax or not. We hope they would. They really should. We'll see. But that's made, if you just can't make a move, you just can't make a move because no one wants to trade with you or on pieces that work. And that's kind of the position that the Pelicans find themselves in right now. So it's going to be interesting to see what they do. But that might mean you've got to just trade Brandon Ingram for other guys that you could trade that then lets you get some of the guys you want that are mid-tier guys but would fit really well on this team and help upgrade the roster. It's not a sexy return for Brandon Ingram. I don't even want to say it's like chess, not checkers, even though it kind of is, but kind of isn't. It's just thinking ahead a little bit here and knowing that you could then move those guys, but also maybe having deals ready to go or having conversations with other teams about that sort of thing. That's how they end up really upgrading this roster in multiple ways, adding 1, 2, 3 guys even in those type of deals. Whereas right now you're really limited if you can't even go get, an off-injured Robert Williams who would be cheap, but there's just no way to make that deal work as a 2-team trade, one-on-one trade. And it's like impossible to figure out 3 teams, 4 teams, anything like that. That becomes really, really difficult. And we don't even want to try and do it because that way lies madness. You'll be stuck on the trade machine, sending me your trades. And I'm going to look at that and be like, what are you talking about here? So they need some of that mid-tier salary. And it likely means trades for one of Ingram or CJ kind of leading to that, then the other guy going to at some point because of Trey's extension. But trying to trade for Robert Williams III, even though we've talked about this a lot on the show, really highlights all of that. So that's going to do it for this episode of Locked On Pelicans. A whole lot more to come the rest of the week here, or at least Wednesday and Thursday. I'm looking forward to it. Back to 5 days a week next week. I'm excited. I hope you are too. As always, I'm your host, Jake Madison, at NOLA Jake on Twitter. This is the Locked On Pelicans podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. See y'all tomorrow.